Imagine Sofia Torres, 23, a barely visible shadow in the chaos of the city, her paintbrush dripping red as if with the blood of her own life. Everyone passes her by until Jackie Chan, master of tricks and soul, bursts in her world with a lightning-fast move and the words, "You fight like a champion." From unknown to legend, her story explodes. But can her art save her from the clutches of death? The sun blazed down on the cracked pavement, turning the city street into a furnace. Sofia Torres, 23, sat hunched over a rickety wooden table she'd dragged from her apartment, her trembling hands arranging a handful of canvases. Each one was a piece of her, a storm of brushstrokes, dark warriors under fractured skies, cities swallowed by shadow. They weren't just paintings, they were her fight, her scream against the disease gnawing at her bones. Beside them, a handwritten sign wobbled in the faint breeze. Original art, raising fund for my treatment. It was her last shot, her only weapon against a fate she refused to accept. The air was thick with the hum of footsteps, car horns, and distant chatter, but Sofia felt invisible. People streamed past, businessmen glued to their phones, tourists snapping photos of graffiti, kids tugging at their parents' sleeves. No one stopped. No one even glanced her way. Her legs ached from hours of sitting, a dull reminder of the illness that drained her more each day. She wiped sweat from her brow, her dark hair sticking to her neck, and forced herself to sit taller. She wouldn't break. Not yet. Her family was drowning. The hospital bills had piled up like a tidal wave. Tens of thousands her parents couldn't pay. Last night, in the dim glow of her bedroom, she'd overheard her father's hoarse whisper, "We'll figure out." But his voice cracked, and Sofia knew the truth. They couldn't. She wouldn't let them lose everything for her. Art had always been her refuge, her way of clawing back control. If she could sell something, anything, she could fight. So here she was, under a scorching sun, betting her life on a brush and some paint. The first hour crawled by in silence. A woman in a red coat slowed, her eyes flicking over a canvas, a lone warrior under a crimson sky, then kept walking. Sofia's stomach twisted, but she swallowed it down. Then came a man in the dark hat. He loomed over her table like a thundercloud, tall and sharp-edged, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His shadow fell across her work as he squinted at the paintings, his lip curling into a sneer. "This is a waste of time, kid," he said, his voice gravelly and cold. "No one's buying street art anymore. Pack it up and save yourself the embarrassment." Sofia's breath caught, her hands clenching under the table. She wanted to snap back, to tell him he didn't know her, didn't know what those colors meant. But her throat locked up, and all she could do was stare as he barked a harsh laugh and turn away, his hat bobbing through the crowd. For a moment, doubt clawed at her. What if he was right? What if this was pointless? She looked down at her canvases, the warrior, the shadows, and shook her head. No, this was her soul spilled onto cloth. She straightened her spine, her jaw tightening. She wasn't done. Time dragged on, the heat pressing harder. Her hands shook as she adjusted the sign again, willing someone to notice. Then, a new shadow fell across the table. She looked up, half expecting the man in the hat again, but it was an older couple. The woman's floral scarf fluttered as she leaned in, her wrinkled fingers brushing a canvas, a desert glowing under a dying sun. "Oh, this is stunning," she murmured, her voice soft and warm. Her husband nodded, his gray eyes steady. "How much for this one?" he asked. Sofia blinked, her heart thudding. $60, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid the moment would shatter. The woman smiled, pulling a crumpled bill from her purse. "We'll take it," she said, and Sofia's chest loosened, a breath she hadn't known she was holding slipping free. She wrapped the painting in brown paper, her fingers clumsy with disbelief. As the couple walked off, canvas tucked under the man's arm, she whispered to herself, "This is real." For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something. Hope. But it wasn't over. As she tucked the money into her pocket, she caught a glimpse of him, the man in the dark hat, lingering at the edge of the crowd. He stood motionless, arms crossed, watching her with a scowl that hadn't softened. Her stomach tightened again. One sale didn't prove anything, not to him, not to the world. The sun climbed higher, the street roared on, and Sofia gripped the edge of her table. She'd won a battle, but the war was just beginning. What would he say now that someone had seen her fight and chosen it? The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the bustling street, but the heat clung to Sofia Torres like a second skin. Her small wooden table was still a fortress of unsold canvases, though the $60 from her first sale burned a quiet hope in her pocket. She'd been at it for hours, her body aching, her dark eyes scanning the crowd for another spark. The man in the dark hat hadn't moved far. He lingered like a vulture, his arms crossed, his smirk a silent taunt. Sofia ignored him, focusing on the colors of her paintings. Warriors in shattered landscapes, skies bleeding red and gold. They were her pulse, her defiance against the disease eating her from the inside. The afternoon wore on, and the crowd thickened. More faces, more indifference. A teenage girl with earbuds paused, glanced at a canvas, then shrugged and walked off. Sofia's hands tightened on the table's edge, her nails digging into the wood. She could feel the man's eyes boring into her, waiting for her to crack. Then he stepped forward again, his boots scuffing the pavement. "Still here, huh?" he sneered, loud enough for a few heads to turn. "One pity sale doesn't mean anything, kid. You're dreaming if you think this'll save you." His laugh was a blade, sharp and cold, slicing through the noise of the street. Sofia's chest burned, not from sickness, but from something fiercer. She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, each word a brick in a wall she was building against him. He snorted, shaking his head, and stalked off again, but his words lingered, heavy as the heat. Doubt crept in, curling around her ribs. One painting wasn't enough. $60 wouldn't touch the mountain of bills waiting at home. She looked at her warrior under the crimson sky, its stance unbroken, and willed herself to match it. Then, like a breeze cutting through the haze, a new figure approached. He was unassuming at first, a man in a faded cap and a lightweight jacket, his steps casual but purposeful. Sofia barely noticed him until he stopped at her table, his hands resting lightly on the edge as he studied her work. He tilted his head, picking up a canvas, a lone fighter standing against a fiery horizon, and turned it in the sunlight. "This," he said, his voice soft with a faint accent, "this is a real battle." Sofia froze, her breath catching. There was something familiar in his tone, but she couldn't place it. Before she could speak, he tugged off his cap with a flourish, and the sunlight caught his grin, wide, warm, unmistakable. Jackie Chan, the Jackie Chan, the man who'd tumbled through a childhood TV screen with impossible leaps and infectious laughter. Her mouth went dry, her heart slamming against her ribs. "What pushed you to paint this?" he asked, leaning in slightly, his dark eyes locked on hers. Sofia swallowed, her voice shaking as it fought its way out. "It's my fight," she said. "Every stroke is a day I'm still here." He didn't reply right away. He just looked at her, his gaze steady, searching. Then, with a move straight out of one of his films, he reached into his sleeve and pulled out a check, like a magician revealing a hidden card. He slid it across the table with a playful smirk. $75,000, he said, his voice firm but kind. "You're tougher than you know, little champion." Sofia's hands trembled as she took the paper, her eyes darting to the black, ink spelling out a number she couldn't fathom. It was real. It was hers. The man in the dark hat, still hovering nearby, went rigid. His jaw dropped, his smugness evaporating as the air shifted. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that Jackie Chan? Did he just—" A phone flashed, then another. Sofia barely registered it, her world narrowing to the man in front of her. Jackie tipped his cap back on, giving her a wink. "Keep punching," he said, stepping back into the throng. The man in the hat's silence was louder than his earlier jeers, his figure shrinking as people pressed closer. A teenage boy yanked off his earbuds, shouting, "Holy crap, it's him!" And the street erupted. Sofia stood there, the check clutched in her hands, as chaos bloomed around her. Phones pointed her way, voices overlapped, and the crowd swelled. Jackie vanished into the sea of bodies, but his words stayed, sharp, alive. The man in the hat glared from the sidelines, his scowl twisting into something darker. Sofia met his eyes for a split second, her chin lifting. She'd won this round, but the fire was just starting. What would happen when the world caught up? The street exploded into a frenzy the moment Jackie Chan melted back into the crowd. Sofia Torres stood frozen behind her battered table, the check for $75,000 trembling in her hands like a fragile lifeline. The air buzzed with shouts. It's Jackie Chan. He gave her what? As phones flashed and voices collided. A teenage boy with wild hair shoved his way to the front, his camera already rolling. This is insane. Look at this, he yelled, panning from Sofia to the check to her canvases. Within seconds, the video was live, a spark igniting a wildfire she couldn't yet grasp. The crowd surged closer, a tidal wave of curiosity and chaos. I'll take that one, a man in a blue shirt barked, thrusting cash at Sofia and snatching a painting of a shadowed city before she could wrap it. A woman with red-dyed hair waved a 20 over her head. This one, the stormy sky. How much? Sofia stuttered, 40, and the woman tossed the bill down, grabbing the canvas with a grin. Hands reached out, voices overlapped. The warrior won. Quick, before they're gone. And Sofia scrambled to keep up, wrapping paintings in brown paper, her fingers fumbling as sweat beaded on her forehead. Her table, once ignored, was now a battlefield. From the edge of the madness, the man in the dark hat watched, his arms still crossed, his face a mask of disbelief. His earlier sneer had twisted into something uglier, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. It's a fluke, he shouted, his voice hoarse and bitter, but the crowd drowned him out. A businessman who'd passed Sofia earlier without a glance elbowed his way back. What's going on? He demanded, then spotted the check. Give me one now, he said, shoving past others to drop a crisp 100 on the table. Sofia handed him a desert scene, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. The noise grew deafening, cameras clicking, people shouting, a child whining, Mom, I want one. Sofia's canvases vanished one by one, the stack shrinking as money piled up beside her sign. Journalists materialized like hawks, notebooks out, lenses zooming. Did Jackie Chan really buy your art? A woman with a microphone asked, shoving it towards Sofia's face. She nodded, words failing her, her chest tight with a mix of awe and panic. The teenage boy's video was already blowing up online. Jackie Chan saves street artist with huge check, and the numbers ticked higher with every refresh. Then Jackie reappeared, slipping through the throng with that effortless grace. He leaned in close, his cap low, and slid a folded note across the table. Fight like I did in Drunken Master, he said, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Before Sofia could respond, he tipped his cap and was gone again, swallowed by the sea of bodies. She unfolded the paper with shaking hands, her pulse hammering. The words were simple, scrawled in sharp ink. You're the real warrior now. Keep going. She clutched it like a talisman, her eyes stinging. The man in the dark hat hadn't moved. Pushed to the fringes by the swelling crowd, he stood rigid, his silence a thunderclap of its own. His gaze locked on Sofia, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Anger, yes, but also something deeper, something raw. She didn't have time to dwell on it. A woman in a floral dress thrust a 50 at her. Last one, she asked, pointing to a warrior under a fractured sky. Sofia nodded, wrapping it, her hand steadier now. The table was nearly bare, the air thick with the smell of ink and sweat. The street pulsed with life, laughter, gasps, the clatter of coins hitting the pavement as someone dropped their change in the rush. Sofia took a deep breath, her chest rising as she looked out at the chaos she'd unleashed. The video hit 1 million views. A reporter shouted, "What's your name?" And she answered, voice cracking, Sofia Torres. The name echoed back, bouncing through the crowd, then beyond, into phones, into screens, into the world. The man in the hat turned sharply, his boots grinding against the pavement as he stalked off, his silhouette shrinking against the tide. Sofia sank in her chair, the note from Jackie still in her fist. The sun dipped below the skyline, painting the street gold, but the fire inside her burned brighter. She'd sold everything, every stroke, every fight, and the money wasn't just survival now. It was a weapon. The crowd thinned, but the whispers didn't stop. "She's the Jackie Chan girl," someone said, snapping a photo. Sofia looked at the empty table, then at the horizon. The storm had broken, and she was still standing. But with the world watching, could she keep the flames alive? The weeks after that fateful day blurred into a whirlwind Sofia Torres could barely comprehend. The $75,000 from Jackie Chan wasn't just a lifeline. It was a battering ram that smashed through the walls of her old life. She paid off the looming hospital bills, silencing the relentless calls from debt collectors that had haunted her parents' nights. The sterile hospital rooms, with their antiseptic sting and flickering lights, became a battleground she could finally leave behind. 2 more chemo cycles, the doctors said, and she'd be in the clear. For the first time in years, Sofia felt the weight lift, not gone but lighter. Her brush, once a desperate plea, was now a torch. The world didn't let her fade back into the shadows. The teenage boy's video had exploded, 10 million views and climbing, spreading her name like wildfire across headlines and screens. Jackie Chan's street artist miracle. Galleries called. Collectors emailed. A sleek art dealer in a tailored suit showed up at her doorstep with a contract and a smile too polished to trust. "Your story's gold, Sofia," he said, tapping his pen on the table. "Let us handle it." She signed, wary but desperate to ride the wave. A month later, her first exhibition opened in a glossy downtown gallery, and the lines stretched around the block. People who'd once stepped over her now clamoring for a ticket. The gallery hummed with murmurs and the clink of wine glasses. Sofia walked the polished floors, her boots scuffing softly against the shine, her dark hair pulled back to reveal eyes that still carried the fight. Her paintings lined the walls, warriors under stormy skies, cities fracturing into light, each one a scar from her past. But the centerpiece stole the breath from the room, a new work, born from the chaos of that street corner. It was a figure, not a shadowed fighter this time, but a woman with a brush in hand, standing tall against the dawn of molten gold. The crowd whispered, "That's her," and Sofia's lips twitched into a quiet smile. Yes, it was. The night was a triumph. Canvases sold for thousands, the numbers dizzying, 5 grand, 10, 20. A critic in a bow tie scribbled furiously in his notebook, muttering about raw resilience. A woman in pearls bought the dawn, painting for a sum that made Sofia's knees weak. But amid the buzz, a simple envelope arrived, slipped into her hand by a gallery assistant. The postmark read Hong Kong. She tore it open, her pulse racing, and found a note in that same sharp scrawl, "Your fight's art, Sofia. Don't stop. Signed, Jackie." She pressed it to her chest, her eyes blurring. Somewhere across an ocean, that first warrior painting hung in his home, a piece of her keeping watch. Victory tasted sweet, but it wasn't complete. A few days later, as Sofia mixed paint in her cramped workshop, a knock rattled the door. She opened it, paint smudged and wary, and there he was, the man in the dark hat. His coat was rumpled, his face gaunt, the cynicism in his eyes dulled by something she couldn't name. He shifted awkwardly, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I want one," he muttered, his voice low, almost choked. Sofia blinked, caught off guard. He pointed to a small canvas on her workbench, a desert glowing under a twilight sky. She didn't ask why. She named a price, $50, and he paid in crumpled bills, taking the painting without a word. As he turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of his expression, tight, conflicted, a man swallowing pride. The door clicked shut, and Sofia let out a soft, incredulous laugh. She'd won that fight, too. The city buzzed with her name. The girl Jackie Chan saved, they called her, sharing that grainy video again and again. Others saw more. A symbol, a spark, proof a brush could cut deeper than fate. Sofia returned to her workshop that night, the air cool, the silence hers. She picked up her brush, its weight familiar, and let it dance across a fresh canvas. The first strokes were bold. Red, gold, a horizon breaking open. "I did it," she whispered, the words dissolving into the hum of the city beyond her window. The disease had lost its grip. The man in the hat had bowed. She wasn't just surviving now, she was rising. But the story wasn't over. The art dealer's smile grew sharper with every sale, his calls more frequent, his promises laced with something Sofia couldn't trust. Whispers reached her, rumors he was skimming profits, claiming her success as his own. And in the quiet moments, her body reminded her it wasn't invincible. A tremor in her hand, a shadow of fatigue. The world watched, hungry for more, and Sofia gripped her brush tighter. She'd climbed from nothing to everything, but the peak was treacherous. Could she hold her ground when the next storm hit? Sofia Torres stood at the edge of a new dawn, but the light felt fragile, flickering against shadows she couldn't shake. The gallery triumph had catapulted her into a world of spotlights and whispers. Her paintings now hung in sleek lofts and glassy offices, her name a murmur on lips that once ignored her. The $75,000 from Jackie Chan had cleared her debts and bought her time, but the chemo cycles dragged on, a quiet war in her veins. She was winning. Doctors marveled at her resilience, but victory came with a price. Fatigue lingered like an uninvited guest, and her hands, once steady, sometimes betrayed her with a tremble she couldn't hide. The art dealer, Victor Crane, was a constant presence now, his polished suits and slick smile weaving through her days. He'd turned her story into a machine. Press interviews, social media campaigns, a second exhibition already in the works. "You're a phenomenon, Sofia," he'd say, his voice smooth as oil, "but we've got to strike while it's hot." The money rolled in, thousands per canvas, a fortune she'd never dreamed of, but so did the unease. Checks arrived late, numbers didn't add up, and Victor's explanations were a tangle of charm and deflection. She'd caught him once, on the phone, laughing about her little sob story, like it was a marketing gimmick. He had gut twisted. This was her fight, not his toy. The city still buzzed with her legend. Strangers stopped her on the street, snapping photos, asking for autographs. "You're the Jackie Chan girl," they'd exclaim, and she'd force a smile, the weight of their awe pressing down. The viral video looped endlessly online, 15 million views now, a grainy testament to that day her life flipped. But fame was a double-edged blade. Hate mail trickled in alongside the praise, anonymous letters calling her a fraud, a charity case riding a celebrity's coattails. She read them in silence, then burned them in her sink, the ash a quiet rebellion. One gray morning, as rain streaked her workshop windows, a package arrived. No return address, just a scrawled note taped to the top, for the warrior. Inside was a battered VHS tape labeled Drunken Master. Sofia's breath hitched. She dug out an old player from a thrift store box, plugged it in, and watched Jackie Chan stumble and spin across the screen, his grin a beacon through the grainy static. Tucked in the case was another note, his handwriting unmistakable. "Strength isn't just fists, it's heart. You got both." She clutched it, her chest tight. He was still out there, rooting for her, a ghost in her corner. But the past wasn't done with her. Late one evening, as she prepped for the next exhibition, the door creaked open. The man in the dark hat stepped in, rain dripping from his coat, his face harder than before. Sofia tensed, paintbrush in hand, but he didn't sneer this time. "I saw your show," he said, his voice rough, eyes darting to a half-finished canvas, a warrior cradling a broken sword. "You're good. Damn good." She waited, wary, as he pulled a folded paper from his pocket and tossed it on her table. It was a sketch, crude but striking, a figure hunched under a storm, signed with his initials. "I used to paint," he muttered. "Couldn't hack it. Thought you wouldn't either." Sofia stared at the sketch, then at him. The cynicism wasn't gone, but it was cracked, revealing a man who'd lost his own fight. "Why'd you come back?" she asked, her voice steady. He shrugged, looking away. Had to see if it was real. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Don't let him eat you alive, kid." Then he was gone, the rain swallowing his steps. Sofia exhaled, the sketch a weight in her hands. He wasn't her enemy anymore, just a mirror of what she'd refused to become. The second exhibition loomed, and Victor pushed harder. Bigger, bolder, he insisted, booking a venue twice the size, hiking prices. Sofia painted through the nights, her hands shaking more each day, her body screaming for rest. One canvas, a warrior facing a faceless crowd, became her anchor, its lines sharp with defiance. But the night before the opening, she found a ledger in Victor's office, left carelessly open during a rush call. Her sales totaled millions, yet her cut was a fraction. He'd been skimming, bleeding her dry while she fought to breathe. The opening arrived, a glittering chaos of lights and voices. Sofia stood amid her work, the warrior painting towering behind her, as Victor schmoozed the crowd. She watched him, her jaw tight, then stepped to the mic. "This is my fight," she said, her voice cutting through the hum. "Not his." She held up the ledger, the numbers stark under the lights, and the room gasped. Victor's smile froze, his eyes darting. The crowd turned, phones out, whispers rising. Sofia didn't flinch. She faced worse than him. The fallout was instant. Headlines screamed betrayal. Victor vanished into legal battles, and Sofia took back her art. Her hands still shook, but they painted on, fiercer, freer. The man in the hat's sketch hung on her wall, a quiet reminder. Jackie's note stayed close, a heartbeat in ink. She'd climbed the edge of triumph and held it, but the world waited. What would she conquer next?